In our previous video, we discussed the first integrated speaking task, read, listen, speak. We also presented an overview of the task and analyzed the requirements in order to complete each individual part of the task.
So, as mentioned before, there are 4 sections on the test. We looked in the first 2 videos at the independent speaking section. In video 3, we looked at the read, listen, and speak integrated task. And now in our final video, we'll be looking specifically at the listen and speak task.
Now, once again, the scoring system for the integrated task is very much like all of the other tasks on the test. The task is evaluated holistically, which, if you recall, means as a whole, looking at an overall appraisal of your speaking ability rather than just focusing on individual errors. Remember that each criterion is measured from 0 to 4, 4 being the highest and 0 the lowest. When you receive your overall TOEFL speaking score, you'll receive a scaled score and your proficiency level.
So, much like with the integrated read, listen, and speak task, there are 2 types that you'll see on the test: academic lecture and discussion, and a campus life discussion. So again, during the listening portion, you'll listen and take notes to either a brief lecture from a professor or to a discussion among students and a professor, or if it's the campus life, you'll hear a discussion among students on campus. Then you'll have to give an oral response involving the information in the listening passage. Most likely you'll have to just summarize that information. And this time you're given 20 seconds to plan instead of 30, and 60 seconds to give an oral response. Now please note, again, there's a transcript from the TOEFL Quick Prep download that we're going to be using. Please do not look at that transcript right now. We're going to be analyzing it a little later in this presentation. So in this very first task, we're actually going to listen to an academic lecture. This is what's provided to us in the TOEFL Quick Prep download. So again, if you're interested more in the campus life situation, I might recommend going back and looking at video number 3. But let's go ahead now and begin to focus on this particular task.
Now we're going to listen to a part of a lecture in a business class. Now, on the real test, you'll see a picture of a professor. But as you get ready to take notes on the lecture, please remember to follow the exact order of the lecture and try to get as many details as you can. Today we'll talk about how companies determine the initial price for their products. By that, I mean when they first introduce a product in the market. There are different approaches, and today we'll discuss 2 of them. They are quite different, each with their own advantages. One approach, or strategy, sets the initial price of the product high, followed by a lower price at a later stage. Why? Well, when introducing a new product, companies want to build a high-quality image for it. Products that cost more are believed to be of higher quality. So, during the early stages of the product life cycle, companies can make very high profits from consumers willing to pay more for a high-quality product. And although consumers know that prices will eventually go down, they're also willing to pay more to get the product sooner. This approach works very well with, innovative high-tech products, for example. Now just think about when video recorders or video cameras or even cell phones first came out. They were very expensive, but then they became much more accessible. Another very common strategy sets an initial price low. Now this happens when the market is already saturated with the product, and the strategy is to undercut its competitors. Now say there's a newly starting computer maker trying to gain market share. So what do? Well, they offer a computer at an affordable price, lower than existing brands. By doing this, the company appeals to new consumers who weren't probably even interested in getting a computer, and, well, of course, to existing consumers who might now be tempted to switch brands. Now, how does this company make profits with its low-priced computer? Well, one thing that's often done is to encourage their customers to buy accessories, also manufactured by them, like printers or software, for example. So now let's talk a little bit about what we noticed in the listening passage before we start looking at the speaking section. You notice it's part of a lecture from a professor. Generally, the lectures will last around 1.5 to 2 minutes. And the topic is usually academic in nature. Now, of course, this brings us back to some ideas we discussed in the TOEFL listening series. The first thing you notice is that the professor is discussing some technical idea or concept, which of course is part of the nature of academic learning in a university. So again, in the reading and in the listening series, one of the purposes of this test is to see how well you can learn new information as it's being presented. Now again, often those concepts are technical or specific to their academic field. So generally they will use vocabulary and ideas that are particular to that academic subject. Now let's go back for a moment and review the difference between words that we define as academic in nature and words that we define as technical. You might recall that academic vocabulary are words that are found across a variety of academic disciplines, especially when reading. So, for example, the word analysis has basically the same meaning in science and history, etc., although the method of analysis those methods might be different. And again, keep in mind, academic vocabulary are words that you were basically already supposed to know when taking the TOEFL test. Technical vocabulary, on the other hand, which oftentimes is referred to as terminology, are usually very discipline-specific, and they may have other meanings in different contexts. For example, if you're studying chemistry and you learn the word bond, this would be different from a bond that you might have in a psychology class between a mother and a child. So again, remember, academic vocabulary is vocabulary you're already supposed to basically know, whereas technical vocabulary, this is part of the idea you're learning from the test. Now, of course, it would be helpful if you already know a lot of technical vocabulary. That would make the test a lot easier. So, if you recall, in order to get a higher score on the test, you must be able to understand fully what the professor is talking about and try to incorporate this technical language that he or she uses in your response. That's very important. Obviously, in the listening section, you had to be able to take notes and recognize technical ideas. But here you actually need to use that technical language in your response. Now, this is an idea we discussed back in the listening section as well. Does the professor actually give us the entire history of the subject? Obviously not. The lecture itself will not be just a general lecture. It will focus on some specific topic or point within this academic area. So, for example, in this video, it was from a business class, but of course it's not on the whole topic of business. It's on some specific point or aspect. So the idea here is we need to think of this as a mini lecture, or as part of a lecture, in which the professor is going to address some specific points. Now this brings us back to a word we discussed in the listening series called genre. Genre considerations tell us how we can use our previous knowledge and try to connect to the information being presented. Now remember, genre refers to what we consider to be the general conventions and expectations for a specific area of study. So, before we listen to the lecture again, let's think about some of the particular genre considerations that we discussed in the listening series and how they might help us in being better prepared for this lecture. Now again, we're talking about a business class, so let's think a little bit first about stuff we already know. How much do we already know about this topic? Have you studied business before? Do you know anything about the ideas of selling products and making money? Now, how will this type of passage be organized? Well, listening to the passage itself, we notice that generally there's a use or explanation of concepts and then examples to break them down. So we would call this perhaps a breakdown organizational style, with these specific subtopics broken into specific details. So generally that's how business classes are organized, and sometimes they use real-life examples or to help illustrate a certain point. Now, the specific point of this broad topic, what is it that they'll be discussing? So which specific idea in business are they going to be discussing? So in case in this particular lecture, they weren't just discussing all of business, they were focusing on a couple of points. Which ideas were those? So again, for more on this particular idea, I would recommend going back to the listening series, especially looking at video number 2, which is academic lecture and taking notes. I'm not going to repeat a lot of that information here. I think it would be very helpful for you to go back and review that video. So this time, let's listen again to the lecture, and as we listen, we're going to use the transcript. So, some things to consider. Notice how the professor begins with a brief introduction, and then will indicate exactly how many points he'll address. And then also notice how he organizes the mini lecture itself. It probably most likely an organizational style that you would find in a business class. And finally, we're going to pay attention to the use of academic and technical vocabulary and concepts. So, the main ideas? Since the professor has only 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes, most likely he or she will be able to give only about 2 or possibly 3 main ideas. And if you notice, the professor really introduced that almost at the beginning. The key is to recognize any important signal words that may help give an early indication as to how many ideas will be included. This is usually something you will find in this part of the test. So, as we analyze the transcript, pay attention to 2 things. So A, do we notice any technical concepts? And B, the organizational style the professor is going to follow, especially identifying any signal words. Here we go. And I'm going to get out my pen tool in order for us to do this. And please notice that in the original sample test, it is a female, a woman, who is giving the lecture. Unfortunately, I couldn't find someone to read the lecture, so in this case, I read it myself, which is why I used the picture of a man instead of a woman. But again, you will hear listening passages from either sex, woman or male or female. So as we go through, let's try to identify some of these technical concepts and how the professor is trying to organize the ideas. Here we go. Today, we'll talk about how companies determine the initial price for their products. By that I mean when they first introduce a product in the market. There are different approaches, and today we'll discuss 2 of them. They are quite different, each with their own advantages. One approach or strategy sets the initial price of the product high, followed by a lower price at a later stage. Why? Well, when introducing a new product, companies want to build a high-quality image for it. Products that cost more are believed to be of higher quality. So, during the early stages of the product life cycle, companies can make very high profits from consumers willing to pay more for a high-quality product. And although consumers know that prices will eventually go down, they're also willing to pay more to get the product sooner. This approach works very well with, innovative high-tech products, for example. Now, just think about when video recorders or video cameras or even cell phones first came out. They were very expensive, but then they became much more accessible. Now, before we move on with the second part of the lecture, I've highlighted a few words already to help us see how the professor's organizing it. So again, notice the talk about different approaches and that there are 2 of them. So already in the introduction, which clearly we can see from the transcript here, the professor has given us a kind of a preview of what we're going to hear. And then notice how the professor repeats some of these ideas. There are different approaches, and there are 2 of them. They're different, and each has its advantages. One approach sets the initial price, and then later the professor uses the word approach again. So this kind of helps pull all of this idea together into the first concept that she's talking about. Now, in just a moment, we'll see how she or he changes from one idea to the next. Now, let's go back and see if we can find some technical concepts or terminology. Well, first off, she mentions initial price and product. Now, these are fairly academic in nature, but of course, they're also very specific to business as well. So notice how she continues to repeat the word product. And then, of course, not only just product, but a high-quality product. And again, you'll notice high-tech for example, high quality product, product life cycle. So again, some of these words are not necessarily technical, but they are words that are specific to business. Now also notice here how the professor uses an example, and this is a good example of cohesion. How the professor mentions high-tech products, so in the kind of beginning here, high-tech products, and then immediately restates them as video cameras, video recorders, and cell phones. So again, the professor is using a very common breakdown strategy where he or she begins with an approach or strategy and then breaks it down into specific examples. So for example, how high-tech products come out, they're very expensive at first, which again, expensive is a restated idea for high quality, and notice that eventually prices will go down. So at the beginning, the price of the product is very high. So again, the professor is using a lot of restatement and these kinds of ideas to help kind of make the paragraph fit together. All right, now let's see how the professor changes direction to give us to the next approach. And again, we'll pull out our pen. Here we go. Another very common strategy sets an initial price low. Now this happens when the market is already saturated with the product, and the strategy is to undercut its competitors. Say there's a newly starting computer maker trying to gain market share. So what do? Well, they offer a computer at an affordable price, lower than existing brands. By doing this, the company appeals to new consumers who weren't probably even interested in getting a computer, and, well, of course, to existing consumers who might now be tempted to switch brands. Now, how does this company make profits with its low-priced computers? Well, one thing that's often done is to encourage their customers to buy accessories also manufactured by them, like printers or software, for example. So again, notice how the professor uses another very common strategy, changes directions, or at least goes to the next point by using that signal word, another. But remember, from the beginning, this particular strategy was going to be different. So in this case, instead of initial price high, the initial price is low. Now notice how the professor again will try to restate that idea. Affordable price, lower than existing brands. Low-priced computer. So the idea here is the professor is using restatement again, synonymous words or rephrased words to help kind of make the whole paragraph fit together. And then notice the professor does, again, the same sort of breakdown idea, using an example. At the end here, examples of printers and software to sell, but also immediately starts with an example here. Notice the professor uses a very common spoken convention, say. In this case, when the professor uses the word say, what they're doing is, say is essentially the same thing as for example. Or in this case, the professor's asking you to imagine this situation. So oftentimes this type of spoken convention is a good way to introduce examples or things that are what we call hypothetical. So in this case, when she says say, what they're saying is basically for example or imagine this situation. So again, the professor's using a breakdown strategy with examples to help us kind of focus on something specific. And again, notice how the professor also uses rhetorical questions. So what do? Then the professor immediately answers them. This, again, is a very common way of organizing a lecture. You might recall this from the video series we did on the listening section. And then uses other words to help us, connect one idea to the next. So, and then, of course, existing customers. So again, notice how she's using this to say sort of, here's the reason, or here's the result. So again, very common ideas that we've seen in the listening series. The professor uses a lot of these kind of common spoken conventions, such as now and well. Again, very common to do that in speaking, to repeat yourself over and over to help things stick together. Very different from what you'd see in a reading section. Okay. So now let's move on to the speaking task. Now again, let's jump into the task itself and see where we correct in what the task is going to be about. Since the professor was talking about two ideas, let's look at the actual description now. Using the points and examples from the lecture, explain the two pricing strategies described by the professor. You have 20 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to respond. So in this case, yes, we can see that very clearly because the professor talked about two different ideas. The task is kind of helping us here a little bit by reminding us that there were two different pricing strategies. So again, the prompt is going to involve summarizing those main points. And as I said before, they're generally two, perhaps three. So in other words, the expectation of the task is to accurately summarize the information the professor gave, basically summarizing everything the professor said. And of course, keep in mind, it would be good to do it in the order that they were presented. So do you remember which one was first? Was it the higher price or the lower price? This is important when you're giving your speaking response. Now, again, in terms of what we're looking for, same as what we've seen before. Again, the highest score is considered a 4. And to see what kind of response, again, looking at a lot of the same things. Is it intelligible? Is it sustained? Do we basically have all of the information that the professor talked about? Did we use good, control of basic and complex grammatical structures? Did we use good vocabulary? And of course, especially in the development itself, we have to find out, did we include all the appropriate detail that the professor included? So really the idea is to try to capture almost everything that the professor tried to say. So remember, a good response is coherent, which means it's logical and relevant to the topic. It contains good grammatical structure, so there are no major errors that prevent understanding. It uses good vocabulary. It's well structured, using nice signal words to help organize the flow. Of course, as we've mentioned in all of our videos, we want to contain as few filler ideas as possible. So we don't want to use any long ahs or ums or long pauses. And finally, that it's intelligible. Now, we may have a few speaking and pronunciation mistakes, but we can still be understood. Now, I think it's important to remind students that this part of the test is not about your opinion of what the professor said. And sometimes I find that students often forget what the actual purpose is of the integrated speaking task. If you remember from the previous video, the ultimate objective is to show your ability to paraphrase and summarize information. Now, recall that paraphrasing is when you're kind of using different words to restate something. And summarizing is when you're trying to get to the most essential information, but usually in fewer words. So recall, in this case, it is not to give your opinion of the professor's lecture. The idea here is that you're trying to capture all of the ideas presented accurately. And I find sometimes that students forget that. They often want to give their opinion of what the professor is saying, and that's not the point. The point here is you want to be able to summarize what the professor is saying. Now recall, in terms of summarizing, the first thing you want to do is make sure you take good notes and try to follow the same order that the professor uses. We also want to use those good signal words to help organize our response, especially signals or sequence signals and additional signals, such as first or next or finally, also in addition. And of course, in this case, the professor used examples. We want to illustrate that too. We want to paraphrase where necessary. Again, we don't have to paraphrase everything, but we probably want to reduce a little bit to help save a little bit of time. I mean, obviously the professor spoke for 2 minutes. In this case, we have only 60 seconds, so we can't say every single word the professor said. However, one key difference, remember, is that if the professor used technical words and ideas, we should probably try to use them in the response. So, for example, using words like initial price, using words like high-tech, high-quality product. We probably need to use some of those examples, pricing strategies. We probably need to use those words in our response. And remember, we're trying to use reported speech instead of direct speech, and trying to use the present tense where it's appropriate. Now, it may not always be appropriate, but in this case, oftentimes we need it when we're kind of summarizing what we call historical information. So let's give an example. And again, from this particular passage, we're not going to look at everything, but here's one example. So in the beginning, with the introduction, the professor kind of gave that very kind of lengthy intro. So the idea is, how can we use reported speech and paraphrase and summarize to help make it a little bit shorter? Well, here's my example. In the lecture, the professor talks about how companies set the initial price for products when they're introduced to market. He says that there are two different approaches, each with advantages. Now notice in the first kind of red color there's the reported speech. The professor talks about. So there's the present tense that we're looking at. And notice that I will try to use the present tense where possible throughout the rest of this response. Notice now how we're trying to paraphrase and summarize the information that's highlighted. So instead of saying companies determine the initial price for their products, by that I mean, so notice this particular spoken convention, the professor is just repeating information. So in this case, we want to reduce it to a little bit fewer number of words. So instead of saying when they first introduce a product in the market, determine initial price, we can try to put those together to set the initial price when they're introduced to market. So that saves a little bit of time. And again, notice the same thing with the second part. The professor says different approaches, and we'll discuss two of them. They're different, each with advantages. So in this case, I summarized it by saying there are two different advantages, two different approaches, each with advantages. Now again, I understand it's easier when we're looking at the written information, but this is just an example of how we can reduce the number of words, maybe not a lot, but reduce them a little bit to save a little bit of time and still get the basic idea of what the professor's saying. So this would be sort of the beginning of the response that we would give. So now we're going to listen to a sample response. Again, note the use of reported speech, paraphrasing, and summarizing. And then also notice how the response follows the organization of the professor's lecture. Here we go.
In the lecture, the professor talks about how companies set the initial price for products when they're introduced to market. And he says that there are two different approaches. Each one has its own advantages. In the first one that she talks about when you set the initial price of the product high and then maybe lower it later. And that's because customers think that they're going to be buying a higher quality and they'll pay more to get it perhaps even sooner. This was one example she talked about was like when you buy high-tech products like video recorders or video cameras or even cell phones. The second example the professor talked about is the exact opposite, setting the initial price lower. And that particular strategy happens when the product is already when the market already is saturated with lots of these other products, and the purpose is to get a lower price than your competitor. So she mentions, for example, bringing a computer out at a lower price, but then other people might buy other accessories like printers or software so that the company can make more money.
Now, and as mentioned in some of the previous videos, preparing for the TOEFL integrated speaking task is a little more difficult, mostly because of their specific nature. So at this point, I am going to remind you that I really do think you need to get a good preparation book. And at this moment, I would suggest, of course, the authentic materials put out by ETS, especially that official guide to the TOEFL. Again, you'll find some other resources available for purchase from their TOEFL website, but really, you're not going to be able to find good free examples, or, you really need to go to the real source, because I think not only do you see the actual examples, but they often contain actual responses from test takers. So really, in preparing for the response, I'm going to recommend that you probably do need to get the official guide. Now, in terms of delivering the response, we've talked about this throughout the video series. Recording yourself really is the best way to get you more comfortable. And once again, you need to follow a systematic approach. Again, we don't want to just keep recording ourselves 4 times in a row. So remember, when you're following these steps, just relax. After preparing for the response, just try to record yourself the first time, but don't pay attention to the time. Just relax and try your best. Then, after you've recorded yourself, go back and listen to the following things. Did you accurately relay that most essential information as required by the task? Does it have many of the common speaking errors? And how long did it take you to respond? And once again, the TOEFL doesn't specify that 60 seconds is necessarily better than 50. But you need to make sure that you include all of the important details from the listening passage. And don't try to speak, too quickly. The idea is we want to be able to understand you as well. Again, record yourself once again, and then this time concentrate on eliminating any ideas that weren't successful and adding more detail and information if possible. And remember, try to pay more attention to time each time you practice. So, for example, if you were under 60 seconds by more than 15 or 20 seconds, You probably didn't include enough information. If you were over 60 seconds, then just relax and concentrate on the ideas that are the most important. More than likely, your first recording may have included too much information, or maybe even too many pauses. So try to focus on only the most interesting and relevant information. And again, I would practice this process a couple more times. As you do this, you want to try to reduce those filler ideas and common speaking errors. You'll probably notice your time will continue to improve as you practice. So some final thoughts for this last video of our series. In the listen and speak integrated task, as we listen, try to take notes and follow the order of the lecture and write down as many details as possible. Remember, the professor will most likely make 2 to 3 main points. And especially try to identify any technical concepts, including vocabulary, and make sure to write them down. As you prepare to speak, remember you have only 20 seconds this time. The prompt will always ask to summarize the points made by the professor. And generally, it will also indicate how many points to summarize. So in case you were too busy taking notes, it will generally say that there were 2 or 3. And then finally, you've got 60 seconds to speak. Remember, try to follow the order of the lecture. Use signal words to connect information. Paraphrase and summarize where possible. And remember, use good reported speech examples. Obviously, include as much accurate detail as you can. Please remember, it's not your opinion. It's the professor's information you're trying to capture. And finally, avoid those common speaking errors. As we stated before, there are lots of great recommended materials available. Again, the ETS provides a couple of different websites that you can use. And especially the official guide, that's another resource that I recommended. And again, our TOEFL TOEIC website has some good information, but again, for a lot of the speaking activities, you're probably going to need official ETS material. Thanks for watching this video series. Coming in March 2013, we will present the TOEFL Writing Skills preparation videos.